Hey, Steve Saretsky here. As always, Canadian real estate market update with a particular focus on Vancouver. If you're getting sort of value and entertainment out of these videos, all I ask you hit thumbs up and subscribe. Questions, comments, put those below. I want to touch this week on everybody's favorite hot topic is inflation. Obviously, we're getting some inflation scares as CPI comes in running hot. Obviously, on a year-over-year comparison, when prices were in the dumps last year. But what I want to talk about is obviously we have we're in this era right now where we are really in unprecedented territory, right? You have this very extreme aggressive monetary policy. You've got seemingly unlimited budget deficits, government spending obviously coming out and basically trying to paper over what would have been a severe recession. And so now you're seeing this marriage between the central bank and the government. So they're becoming basically intertwined. And now obviously people are coming out and calling it MMT, modern monetary theory, which again, if you're unfamiliar with the term, it's essentially a theory where if as a government, you basically have unlimited spending ability. You can spend as much as you want because you are basically borrowing money, or you have the ability to print money in your own currency. So as long as you have your own central bank to basically fund those deficits, you can effectively spend unlimited amounts of money. The only thing that restrains that spending is inflation. And they say, to basically curb that inflation, the idea is that you can simply tax it away. So, nobody in Canada wants to call it MMT. Nobody's saying it's MMT. But again, if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And so I want to loop here now to one more time is Mr. Pierre Poilievre's comments. He recently interviewed, or not interviewed, but he was in the House of Commons with some dialogue with the BOC's Tiff Macklem. And again, I want to emphasize that this channel it's not a political channel. Okay, I don't really care if it's coming from Pierre, or if it's coming from Jagmeet over at the NDP. I don't care. What I care about is what I'm finding is that Pierre is the only one the only one that's asking the difficult questions. Everybody's basically gives these central bankers like the free pass. Like nobody questions what they're doing behind the curtain. It's almost kind of taboo. And so he seems to be the only one that's publicly coming out and asking the difficult questions. Now, the difficult questions are, I understand there's a need and a want and a desire to help. And so the idea is that, okay, well, let's just print a bunch of money and it will help and we'll paper over the economy, give everybody a check. And that's all well and great. But we also need to acknowledge the fact that there are side effects or repercussions from printing money. You cannot simply just print money and not have a negative consequence. And so let's first and foremost, let's link to Pierre's comments right here, who I should add, I know a lot of you have requested him on the show. Pierre and his team have agreed to come on the show, it looks like next month. So we will have him on next month. But without further ado, Pierre's comments right here.
Governor, I was fascinated to hear you say that the purpose of your quantitative easing, that is these mass purchases of government bonds, is to help households and businesses. And you didn't mention that it was designed to help governments spend borrowed money. On April 19th, the finance minister introduced a budget which proposed a deficit of $154 billion. That works out to $3 billion a week. That's how many bonds, how many dollar values worth of bonds the government will have to sell. How much are you proposing to buy every single week? Just the number, please.
Right now, we're buying $3 billion a week.
Well, what a coincidence that is. The government is going to be selling $3 billion worth of bonds per week, and you're going to be buying $3 billion a week. Mr. Chairman, it is a miracle. What a coincidence that those two numbers line up so closely. And you announced that $3 billion number exactly 2 days after the minister laid out the same number in her budget. Is that a pure coincidence?
What I can tell you is that our purchases of government bonds are guided by our inflation target. We have seen considerable progress in the recovery. We don't need as much quantitative easing, and that's what guided our decision to
Right.
reduce the amount of purchases each
So,
week.
so on an annual basis, the government will borrow a net $154 billion, and you will provide a net $156 billion. So there's an extra $2 billion. Keep the change, Mr. Government. That has to be a coincidence. But you're saying, no, the purpose of this is the inflation target. Well, 3 of your 4 measures of inflation are now above the target, which would presumably mean you would pull back. And even the Financial Post said central banks and government out of touch with Main Street when it comes to rising costs of living.
So again, as you can see, we have this scenario that again, Pierre is obviously critiquing, is you've got this government spending, you've got basically the BOC, the Bank of Canada, matching that deficit spending, that budget deficit, $3 billion of QE per week. And they're trying to taper. And so we're not calling it MMT, but the reality is if you think about this logistically, obviously if you have more bond issuance coming to the market, more supply, more government debt being issued, obviously more supply and let's assume the same levels of demand for government debt, naturally investors would want to be compensated for that. So interest yields would have to push higher. Obviously when yields push higher, it becomes that much more difficult to service increasing amounts of debt. So the Bank of Canada's, without implicitly saying it, they're basically their goal or their mandate is we have to keep interest rates on the floor. So if the government is borrowing all this money, if you're borrowing all this money, you heard Krista Freeland talk about this, the finance minister. She says, well, we're borrowing all this money because we can afford to. The cost to borrow has never been lower. We're keeping our debt servicing costs down. Well, again, but the only way to keep the debt servicing costs down is by having the central bank come in and suppress the interest rates on that. If they weren't a buyer in the market, the real rate, if you had a free market, you would have much higher interest rates. And so these levels of government spending or borrowing would not be possible. And it's the same thing for the household level, right? You wouldn't be able to support the level of house prices today if mortgage rates were 4, 5, 6%. It's simply not possible. People would crumble under the weight of the debt servicing costs. And so why do I bring this all up? Because we had this interesting dialogue on finance Twitter. I was going back with my boy Stephen Panoisi there at Better Dwelling. But the point was being, I said, listen, you're going to have this crippling, if real interest rates continue to rise, so everybody's calling inflation, interest rates are going to rise. If real rates rise, that will basically push debt servicing costs up, and basically the burden of debt would basically slowly crush everybody, right? If you have more and more people spending more of their incomes on servicing debt levels, that lowers consumption in the economy, and basically everything slows down. So the central banks and the governments around the world, the whole system is predicated on suppressing the level of interest rates. And so what ultimately needs to happen, and this happened in the 1940s, this was my argument, it says, listen, I understand that we want free markets and that, hey, if there's inflation, that naturally interest rates would rise. If you have inflation, investors will reprice the bond market and yields will push higher. That's assuming that you have a free market. What I'm arguing is that through a version of yield curve control, there's many ways to do yield curve control, the government levels will have to suppress the interest rate. So for example, let's unwind this. The last time the United States did yield curve control was in the 1940s. Now, you had a real negative interest rate in the 1940s of 14%. Okay, so look at this chart. You had, this is basically the yield, you had yield curve control where basically inflation was running hot and the government basically pinned the government bond market. They pinned rates to the floor, and so they allowed inflation to run hot. So at one point, for a period of time in the 1940s, the real interest rate was negative 14%. And so what does this mean? So it's important to understand the real rate of interest, because you have two things. You have nominal rates and you have real interest rates. So nominal rates can go up. In today's environment, if we get inflation, nominal rates can go up. So let's just say, for simplicity's sake, you have a situation where nominal rates push up from, let's say, 1%, they go up to 2%, up to 3%. That would be catastrophic, right? But not if you have inflation running at 4%, 5%, 6%. That starts to change the game, because now you have inflation is still running much higher than the cost of interest. And so that basically, again, when you have debt problems, when you're suffocating under the levels of debt that we have today, which is record amounts of debt across all sectors, public, private, etc., the only way to overcome that is you can have two ways. There is only two ways. Well, actually, there's three ways. I should say there's three ways. You can grow your way out of it, you can inflate your way out of it, or you can default. And so default is not the first option. No government is going to willingly default on their debt. History has proven time and time again is that the option is to inflate it away, because growth becomes extremely difficult in an environment where you have suffocating amounts of debt, weak demographics, an aging labor force. So the reality is we're not going to be able to grow it out. I mean, go back over the last 10 years and look at GDP growth rates. I mean, it's been anemic, and so there's nothing to suggest that suddenly we're going to have a surge of growth on a sustainable basis. So we're going to inflate our way out. That is simply the only way to do that, and the way to do that is you're going to have to let inflation run hot. So don't raise interest rates. Let the economy run hot. Let it run in overdrive. And when the bond market decides it's time to push rates up because inflation is going out of control, the government will have to step in with a form of yield control. And so you need to keep real interest rates negative for an extended period of time to allow growth and inflation to slowly chip away at the levels of debt. And so that is the whole premise of it. That's what I was saying. And so again, history has said, now I'm not going to sit here and tell you that this is going to be successful, that this is not going to come with volatility, that this is not going to mean that mortgage rates can ever rise. I certainly think that they can, and they probably will, but we have to understand that what the objective and the goal is to have, you need to let the economy run hot, and you need to suppress yields. And if there's any indication of that whatsoever, all we had to do was look at the Federal Reserve's comments. Jay Powell came out this past week, basically saying like we're basically never raising interest rates. I mean, obviously, I think they're going to at some point, but that was essentially the tone. So it's interesting enough because everyone's going here and going, yeah, look at the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada's tightening policy. They're trying to taper. Oh my gosh, interest rates are just going to start going up in 2022 now. But what the reality is the Bank of Canada does not matter. They don't matter in the global scheme. So if you have the major central banks in the world continuing to do quantitative easing and continuing to keep interest rates pinned to the floor, we naturally import that monetary policy. So if you've got the BOJ and if you've got the ECB and if you've got the Federal Reserve, the big three, basically maintaining their asset purchases and growing their balance sheet through quantitative easing, Canada will naturally import that. So we don't necessarily need to continue to do QE. And just one of the things I was looking at this past week, we all know the similar to Canada, the U.S. housing market is obviously running hot. I think you've got national home prices as measured by the Case-Shiller up 12% year over year in March. was it February or March? Anyways, you got U.S. home prices running high. And Jay Powell comes out and says, well, we're watching the hot housing market. We're going to be very careful. He said, we're carefully monitoring the housing market. But meanwhile, we're also continuing to do $40 billion per month of mortgage-backed security asset purchases. The two and two don't go hand in hand. In fact, I'm going to do it justice. Let's clip to Jay Powell's comments right here.
I want to circle back to the housing market. It's just kind of confusing, the question and your answer. The housing market is strong, prices are up, and yet the Fed is buying $40 billion per month in mortgage-related assets. Why is that? And are those purchases playing a role at all in pushing up prices? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we started buying MBS because the mortgage-backed security market was really experiencing severe dysfunction, and we've sort of articulated, what our exit path is from that. It's not meant to provide direct assistance to the housing market. That was never the intent. It was really just to keep that it's a very close relation to the Treasury market and a very important market on its own. And so that's why we bought, as we did during the global financial crisis, we bought MBS too. Again, not an intention to send help to the housing market, which was really not a problem this time at all. So, it's a situation where we will taper asset purchases when the time comes to do that, and those purchases will come to zero over time, and that time is not yet.
So as always, what central bankers say and what they're actually doing, all we need to know is the game is what I've just explained to you. The game is we're going to print money. We're going to let inflation run hot. We're going to let the economy run hot. We're going to do our best to not have to raise rates. We're going to do our best to suppress yields. And the name of the game is asset markets are going to rip. And that's exactly what they've been doing. And don't get me wrong, valuations are crazy. They're crazy in every asset class. But unfortunately, the alternative is to be stuck in a fiat currency system, which is implicitly being debased by every single country in the world and every single major central bank. So the name of the game is assets. And that's what we'll continue to focus on every single week. See you next week.